It's just after 9:30 at night, and David Camm is pulling into the driveway of his home in Georgetown, Indiana. He's just come from a pickup basketball game at his old church gym, the same game he plays most Thursday nights with a group of men who have known him for years. He's tired. His shirt is still damp from the game. He's thinking about nothing more complicated than getting inside, checking on his family, and going to bed. He steps out of his truck. He walks toward the garage. And in the next 10 seconds, everything he understands about his life will be gone, even though he is the only one left standing to explain it. Inside that garage on the concrete floor are his wife, Kimberly, and his 2 children, Bradley and Jill. All 3 have been shot. David Camm will later say that he saw Bradley first, that he found Kimberly a few feet away, and that he pulled 7-year-old Jill's body out from beneath the family car, trying and failing to find any sign of life in her. He will say he screamed. He will say a neighbor came running. He will say he called 911 in a state he can barely remember, because there is no version of that phone call that could ever sound calm. Within hours, police will decide that story is a lie. Within 2 years, a jury will agree with them, and David Camm, an 11-year veteran of the Indiana State Police, a man who spent his career wearing a badge meant to protect people exactly like his own family, will be sent to prison for murdering them. It will take 13 years, 3 separate trials, and the DNA of a man nobody in Camm's life had ever heard of, to prove that the story told about him in that courtroom was never really built on evidence at all. It was built on the life investigators became convinced he was secretly living underneath the uniform. Before we go any further into this one, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city down in the comments and let me know what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one of these, so don't be shy. If you want to understand how a decorated Indiana State Trooper ended up standing on the wrong side of his own badge, convicted not once but twice for a crime he did not commit, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this case only gets stranger from here, and I promise you, you do not want to miss where it goes. To understand how deep this case cuts, and why an entire community turned on one of its own so quickly, you have to understand who David Camm was before that September night. He wasn't a stranger passing through Georgetown, Indiana. He was one of the town's most visible, most trusted faces. For 11 years, Camm served as a trooper with the Indiana State Police, working the kind of long, unpredictable shifts that come with the job, traffic stops in the middle of the night, wrecks on rural highways, the quiet, unglamorous work of being the person people call when something has already gone wrong. Outside of the uniform, Camm coached youth basketball, which is part of the reason he was at that church gym the night everything changed. It wasn't a one-time outing. It was a standing Thursday night tradition, the same group of men, the same gym, week after week, for years. These weren't casual acquaintances who might misremember a night. They were people who had built a routine around David Camm's presence in it, which is exactly why, later, 11 of them would be willing to swear under oath to precisely where he was and when. At home, David and Kimberly Camm had built what looked, from every visible angle, like an ordinary family life. 2 young children, Bradley and Jill, still small enough to need their parents for almost everything. A modest house in a small town where, as is true in most small towns, everybody more or less knew everybody else's business, or at least believed they did. Kimberly worked. David worked. They showed up to school events, to church, to the same gym on the same nights, building the kind of visible, repetitive, unremarkable life that communities point to when they want reassurance that nothing bad happens here. But investigators would come to insist there was another version of David Camm entirely. A second man living underneath the trooper's uniform, the coaching whistle, and the family photographs on the wall. A man capable of things the public David Camm supposedly never let anyone see. And once that idea took hold inside the investigation, it became almost impossible to dislodge. no matter what the physical evidence in that garage actually showed. The story of the double life had already started writing itself before a single piece of forensic testing had come back from the lab. There's something worth sitting with here before we move any further into this story. Communities build a kind of shorthand around people like David Camm. The badge does a lot of that work automatically. It tells neighbors this is someone trained to run toward danger, someone vetted, someone accountable to a chain of command that presumably wouldn't hand a gun and a title to just anyone. When a man wearing that shorthand becomes a suspect, the shock isn't just about the crime itself. It's about how completely the story people thought they understood has to be rewritten, and how eager some people become to have that new story handed to them quickly, cleanly, with a villain they can finally point to. That eagerness would end up mattering more than almost anyone realized at the time. September 28, 2000, started like any other Thursday for the Camm family. Kimberly moved through the evening routine with Bradley and Jill while David got ready for basketball, the same as he had most weeks that year. He arrived at the church gym around 7 o'clock. 11 men would later testify, independently of each other, that David Camm was there with them, on that court from roughly 7 until just after 9. A 2-hour window with 11 separate sets of eyes on him the entire time. At approximately 9:30 that night, Camm left the gym and drove home. What happened in the next several minutes depends entirely on who you choose to believe, because there is no version of it that anyone but David Camm actually witnessed. According to Camm, he pulled into the garage and immediately saw Bradley's body on the concrete. He said he moved toward Kimberly next, only a few feet away, and then discovered Jill trapped beneath the family car. He said he pulled her out. He said he tried to find a pulse. He said that when he couldn't, something in him simply broke, and what came out of him next, the screaming, the panicked call to 911 that investigators would later describe as inconsistent and strange, was not a performance. It was a father discovering in real time that his children were gone. Listen back to any real 911 call from a moment like that, and you'll notice something investigators sometimes forget in the moment they're standing in the middle of a crime scene. Real panic doesn't sound clean. It doesn't sound like a person calmly reciting facts in order. It sounds fragmented. It sounds like someone's mind trying to process something it was never built to process, in real time, while a dispatcher on the other end of the line is asking for an address. Whatever David Camm sounded like on that call, investigators had already decided within minutes what it meant. They just hadn't decided yet whether they were right. Police arrived to a scene that would define the next 13 years of David Camm's life, and in some sense, the rest of it entirely. 3 bodies. A distraught husband and father standing in the middle of the wreckage of his own family, unable to fully explain himself in the way investigators expected a person to explain trauma. And almost immediately, before ballistics had been run, before autopsies had been completed, before a single piece of forensic evidence had actually been analyzed in a lab, a theory began to take shape at the scene. It wasn't a theory built from what the evidence showed. It was a theory built from what a handful of investigators had already started to believe about the kind of man David Camm secretly was. Grief, as anyone who has lived through sudden loss can tell you, doesn't always look the way the outside world expects it to. Some people go quiet. Some people fall apart in ways that look, to an untrained eye, almost too controlled. Some people scream and shake and can't get a coherent sentence out for hours. Investigators standing in that garage that night were watching a man experience the worst moment of his life in real time, and they were doing it through the lens of people trained to be suspicious first and sympathetic second. It's a necessary instinct in a lot of cases. In this one, it would prove to be the first domino in a chain that took 13 years to fully knock down. This is the point where the case stops being about a crime scene and starts being about a story. The story of who David Camm supposedly was underneath the trooper's uniform. Investigators learned early in the process that Camm had a documented history of infidelity, multiple affairs over the years, some of which he did not deny when asked directly. And once that single fact entered the case file, it seemed to color the way investigators interpreted everything else in front of them. Detectives didn't need much time to connect two dots that, in hindsight, had almost nothing to do with each other. A man who lived one life in public and a different one in private, the reasoning went, was a man capable of anything up to and including annihilating the very family that public life depended on. It's a seductive theory, the kind that fits neatly into a closing argument. It's also, as decades of wrongful conviction cases across this country have shown, one of the most dangerous shortcuts an investigation can take, treating a man's personal flaws as if they were proof of his capacity for violence, rather than two entirely separate questions that deserve to be answered separately. A crime scene photographer named Rob Stites, who police believed to be a qualified blood spatter analyst, told investigators the garage showed signs of a cleanup, and that Camm's shirt bore what he identified as high-velocity impact spatter, the kind of microscopic blood pattern typically associated with being close enough to a gunshot to have been the shooter. To investigators who had already begun building their case around the idea of a hidden, violent David Camm, this was the confirmation they'd been waiting for. To a jury who would later hear it delivered with total scientific confidence, it would sound less like a theory and more like certainty. It would take well over a decade for anyone with the authority to reopen the case to seriously question whether it had ever been sound science to begin with. What nobody in that investigation seemed willing to sit with in those early days was a simpler and far less satisfying possibility that a man could have secrets, could have failures in his marriage, could be far from a perfect husband, and still be exactly what he claimed to be that night. A father who came home to find his family already gone. There's a pattern that shows up again and again in wrongful conviction cases across this country, and it's worth naming directly because it's exactly what happened here. Investigators find a flaw. The flaw is real, it's uncomfortable, and it makes the suspect easier to dislike. From there, it's a short, almost frictionless leap to treating that flaw as if it explains everything else about the case, as if a man capable of one kind of betrayal must logically be capable of the very worst kind imaginable. It's not evidence. It's a shortcut dressed up to look like evidence, and juries, understandably, have a hard time telling the difference when it's delivered with enough confidence from the front of a courtroom. By the time David Camm stood trial, the state's theory had fully calcified into a narrative. A philandering husband, exposed by his own infidelity, who murdered his wife and children rather than face what that exposure would cost him. The prosecution leaned into that story with everything they had, and the blood spatter testimony gave it the scientific legitimacy it needed to feel less like speculation and more like fact laid out plainly for a jury to weigh. Camm's defense team pointed to something the state never had a clean answer for: 11 separate witnesses, none of them related to Camm, none of them with any apparent motive to protect him, all placing him at that church gym until almost 9:30, the exact window investigators believed the murders had taken place. 11 people willing to stand up in a courtroom and say the same thing under oath, with nothing to gain from lying. It should have been close to an insurmountable alibi. But an alibi, no matter how solid, no matter how many voices back it up, struggles to compete with a courtroom being told, by someone presented as a scientific expert, that a bloodstain simply does not lie. In 2002, a jury convicted David Camm of murdering his wife and both of his children. He was sentenced to life in prison. Somewhere inside an Indiana courtroom that day, a carefully constructed story about a trooper's hidden double life had just defeated 11 eyewitnesses and a family that no longer existed to speak in its own defense. Camm was led away in handcuffs, still insisting, as he would insist for the next 11 years, that he had told the truth from the very first night. It would take a very long time before anyone in a position of power was willing to seriously entertain the possibility that he had been telling the truth all along. Think about what that verdict actually required a jury to believe. Not just that David Camm was capable of murdering his wife and children, but that he had done it inside a window of time 11 separate witnesses swore he wasn't there for, then somehow staged a crime scene sophisticated enough to fool investigators, all while behaving in the immediate aftermath in a way so raw and disoriented that it read to some as suspicious and to others as exactly what unbearable grief looks like. The math never fully worked. It didn't need to. The story worked instead, and for a jury handed a confident expert witness and a defendant with a documented history of infidelity, the story was enough. I want to hear from you on this one right now before I tell you what happens next. What's your gut telling you at this point in the story, guilty or innocent? Drop it in the comments below. I genuinely go through these, and I'll be curious to see how many of you end up changing your answer by the time we get to the end of this video. Convictions built on shaky foundations don't always collapse quickly, and David Camm's did not. His appeal took years to work its way through the Indiana court system, but when it finally succeeded, it exposed something the original trial jury had never been given the chance to hear. The blood-spatter analysis that anchored the state's entire case, the single piece of science that had turned suspicion into a life sentence, was seriously, fundamentally flawed. The cleanup investigators believed they'd identified in that garage turned out not to be a cleanup at all. It was simply blood behaving the way blood behaves once it has been exposed to open air for a period of time, a basic forensic reality that had somehow been missed or ignored in the original analysis. The high-velocity impact spatter sites had testified to under oath turned out, in multiple documented instances, to be inaccurate interpretations of ordinary staining. The kind of mistake that, once made under the weight of expert testimony, is almost impossible for a jury to see past in real time. Camm's conviction was overturned. For a brief moment, it genuinely looked like the truth might finally be catching up to the story that had been told about him for years. But the state of Indiana was not finished with David Camm. Rather than step back and reconsider the case from the ground up, the way any of us might hope a justice system would when its own forensic foundation crumbles, prosecutors doubled down, and this time they had something new to build around. It's easy, watching from the outside years later, to assume an overturned conviction should feel like vindication. In practice, for David Camm, it was closer to a brief window of hope wedged between two much longer stretches of imprisonment. An appeal doesn't erase the years already served. It doesn't undo a life sentence's worth of damage to a reputation, a family, a sense of safety in the world. It simply reopens the door, and in this case, walking back through that door led straight into a second trial built on an entirely different, and in some ways even less plausible, theory of what happened that night. DNA recovered from a sweatshirt left behind at the crime scene, run through a national database, produced a match. A man named Charles Boney. Boney had a lengthy criminal record. Boney, prosecutors would eventually be forced to concede, had almost certainly been inside that garage the night the family was killed. For a case that had just lost its central piece of forensic evidence, this should have been the moment everything changed. Instead, rather than treat it as the break that could finally clear an innocent man, the state constructed an entirely new theory, built from nothing but speculation, designed to keep David Camm exactly where he already was. It's worth pausing on how unusual this is. A wrongful conviction case doesn't always come with a second suspect this clearly identified. Most stay unsolved, or stay pinned on the original defendant simply because nobody else was ever seriously investigated. Here, prosecutors had an actual name, an actual criminal record, and actual DNA evidence connecting a real, alternative suspect to the scene. And rather than follow that evidence wherever it led, The case bent itself into a new and considerably stranger shape, just to avoid admitting the first theory had been wrong. The second trial should have been simpler than the first. There was now a name attached to actual physical evidence, a real, documented suspect with a criminal history and DNA tying him directly to the scene. Instead, prosecutors introduced a theory that was almost impossible for a jury to meaningfully evaluate, because there was almost nothing behind it to evaluate in the first place. That Camm and Boney had somehow acted together that night, that Camm had aided and abetted a man he had never once been shown to have any prior connection to. There was no evidence the two men had ever met before that night, no shared history, no phone records linking them, no witnesses ever placing them together at any point in either of their lives. Nothing beyond the simple, uncomfortable fact that both men, in the state's telling, needed to be responsible for what happened in that garage for the original theory to survive its own collapse. To Camm's defense, it was almost impossible to conceive of a stranger accusation, an unrelated ex-convict, somehow recruited, for reasons the state never adequately explained to any jury, brought in to help a suburban father murder his own wife and children. Despite the gap in logic, despite the 11 alibi witnesses who had never wavered, despite a blood-spatter theory that had already been formally discredited once, David Camm was convicted a second time. 2 separate juries, 2 separate convictions, and still, at the center of both of them, the actual physical evidence connecting David Camm himself to the murders had never materially existed in the way jurors were led to believe it had. What had existed, consistently, across both trials, was a story about a man secretly capable of anything. And stories, once a jury believes them, turn out to be remarkably resistant to fact. By the time the second verdict came down, David Camm had now spent years of his life inside a legal system that had convicted him twice, on 2 different theories, using 2 different explanations for how the murders supposedly happened. And the only constant across both of them was David Camm himself sitting at the defense table. If that inconsistency alone doesn't raise a red flag, it's worth asking what would. A single, accurate theory of a crime shouldn't need to be rebuilt from scratch the moment its foundation collapses. The fact that this one was rebuilt, rather than reconsidered, says something about how invested the state had become in the outcome, rather than the truth. Stay with me here, because what happens next is the exact reason this case ended up changing how prosecutors across the country are allowed to present forensic testimony in a courtroom. If you've made it this far into the video, you're about to see exactly how this entire narrative finally unraveled, and I promise, it is worth staying for. The unraveling, when it finally came almost entirely through Charles Boney himself. Further investigation tied Boney far more directly to the crime scene than prosecutors had ever wanted to admit under their aiding and abetting theory. Touch DNA recovered from the scene, additional physical evidence, a pattern of forensic details that increasingly pointed toward one man, acting entirely alone, with David Camm nowhere near that garage at the time the murders actually occurred. At the same time, the timeline the state had relied on across 2 separate trials began to fall apart under closer, more rigorous scrutiny. New forensic analysis suggested the murders had happened somewhat earlier than originally believed, inside a window during which David Camm had 11 separate witnesses who could account, without contradiction, for exactly where he was: a basketball court. A group of men with absolutely nothing to gain by lying for him, and every reason, after watching him convicted twice, to simply stay quiet if they weren't certain. This is what a wrongful conviction actually looks like from the inside, once you strip away the courtroom drama and the closing arguments. It's rarely one single, dramatic piece of evidence that changes everything overnight. It's the slow, grinding accumulation of a truth that had been sitting there the entire time, waiting patiently for someone with the authority to finally take it seriously. 11 witnesses, a discredited forensic theory. A second suspect whose physical connection to the scene only grew stronger the more closely anyone looked. Piece by piece, over more than a decade, the story of David Camm's double life began to collapse under the weight of the only thing that had never actually been on its side, the evidence itself. Somewhere in Indiana during all of this, Charles Boney was living his own life, having already been connected to the murder weapon and to physical evidence at the scene, while a father who had lost his entire family sat in a cell for a crime that the state's own case, examined honestly, could no longer fully explain. It's the kind of detail that's almost hard to sit with once you say it out loud. Two men, one of them demonstrably tied to the scene through DNA and physical evidence. The other tied to nothing but a theory about the kind of person investigators had already decided he must secretly be. By the time David Camm's case reached a third trial, the physical evidence pointing toward Charles Boney as the sole perpetrator had become extraordinarily difficult to ignore, even for a prosecution that had spent over a decade building its case around a different man entirely. The blood-spatter theory that had started this entire chain of events had already been dismantled years earlier. The aiding and abetting theory introduced in the second trial had never been supported by anything beyond speculation and circumstantial framing. What remained, once the state's narrative was finally stripped down to what could actually be proven, was a man who had told the same story from the very first night, a man who came home from basketball and found his family already dead, and who was never given the chance to simply grieve them. In 2013, a jury acquitted David Camm of all charges. 13 years after he first walked into an Indiana courtroom as a grieving husband and father, he walked back out of one as a free man, cleared of a crime that had never actually been his. 13 years he would never get back. 13 years his son and daughter would have spent growing up, had Charles Boney never crossed paths with their family that September night. David Camm didn't just lose 2 trials. He lost more than a decade of his life to a version of himself that investigators had constructed almost entirely out of his personal failures. A version a jury had believed twice over, built on the idea that a man who kept secrets in one part of his life must be capable of anything in every other part of it. Try to picture what those 13 years actually looked like from inside a cell. Every appeal filed with the knowledge that the state had already proven twice it was willing to rebuild its entire theory of the case, rather than admit it might be wrong. Every year that passed was a year further from the people he'd lost. A year he couldn't spend visiting graves on birthdays. A year spent watching a justice system slowly, reluctantly, incrementally catch up to a truth he had never stopped repeating. Charles Boney, meanwhile, carried a documented criminal history into that courtroom and would ultimately be convicted for the murders himself. A conviction that, in a very real sense, could have come years earlier, sparing an innocent man over a decade of his life, if the state had been willing to follow the evidence instead of protecting its own prior conclusions. There is a specific kind of injustice in being disbelieved not despite the truth, but because of who investigators had already decided you secretly were. David Camm wasn't convicted because the evidence pointed to him. He was convicted because a story about his character was easier to accept than the far more unsettling alternative, that sometimes terrible things happen to families for reasons that have nothing to do with the private failures of the man left standing in the wreckage. There's a version of this story where the double life belongs entirely to David Camm, the decorated trooper on one side, the infidelity on the other, exactly the way prosecutors framed it across 2 separate trials. But look a little closer at everything that actually happened here, and the real double life at the center of this case never belonged to him at all. It belonged to the system that convicted him, not once, but twice. One face of that system stood in a courtroom and told a grieving father with total confidence that his personal flaws were proof he had murdered his own children. The other face, years later, was quietly forced to admit that the forensic science had never actually supported that story, that the second theory had been built on nothing more than the need to explain away an inconvenient piece of DNA, and that an innocent man had spent over a decade in prison, while the real evidence pointed somewhere else the entire time. That is the real double life running underneath this entire case. A justice system fully capable of presenting absolute certainty to a jury, and it turns out, just as capable of being catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. David Camm's case has since become one of the most closely studied examples of how flawed forensic testimony can override a strong eyewitness alibi, and how a personal narrative about a defendant's character can quietly, almost invisibly, replace the actual burden of proof a prosecution is supposed to carry. Legal scholars and forensic experts have pointed to this case for years now as a warning about exactly how much weight jurors place on expert testimony, even when that testimony comes from someone whose qualifications don't fully hold up to scrutiny. It's a warning that extends well beyond David Camm, into every courtroom where a confident voice at the front of the room is treated as equivalent to actual proof. He got his freedom back in 2013. Nothing gave him back the 13 years. Nothing gave him back the family he lost in that garage in Georgetown, Indiana, on a Thursday night that started out no different from any other. What this case leaves behind, more than anything, is a question worth sitting with long after the video ends. How many other people are currently living out some version of David Camm's 13 years right now, convicted not by evidence, but by a story someone else decided to believe about who they secretly were? One more before we close this one out. What's the weather like where you are right now? Let me know down in the comments. I like knowing who's actually out there watching, no matter where in the world you happen to be tonight. If this case pulled you in the way it pulled me in while I was researching it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I've got another wrongful conviction story going up soon, and based on how this one unfolded, I think you're going to want to be here for it. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, drop a comment and let me know what stuck with you most. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.